The Liberty ship rolled under a white sky that smelled of salt and engine oil. On its flaking gray rail stood Gefreiter Hans Weber, hands cuffed by boredom rather than by steel now, staring at a coastline that was not France and not Africa, but something horizon-wide and unapologetically new. New York rose like a bristling machine. Tugboats fussed. Gulls wrote invisible question marks in the air. When the band on the pier struck up, anchors away, an American guard with a cornfield accent muttered, almost kindly, "Welcome to the States, fellas. Geneva rules. That means ice, shade, and no funny business." Hans tasted the word States like a foreign spice. He'd been captured outside Bizerta, marched past groves of oranges he wasn't allowed to touch, packed into a ship whose hold hummed like a hive. He had imagined barbed wire and cold tin plates. He had not imagined a brass band. "Keep your eyes front," barked Feldwebel Krantz, their self-appointed barracks leader, the kind of man whose back looked like a sermon. No fraternizing. Hans kept his eyes front and failed to keep his heart from leaning sideways toward the small American miracle of music in a harbor. 4 days later, after a train that crossed continents of wheat and red clay, they arrived at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, one of dozens of POW compounds hidden in the continental heart. The gate was ordinary, wire helixes, guard towers, a wooden sign whose paint blistered in the heat. But inside, the rows of long barracks were spaced neat as school copybooks, and from a building near the flagpole came the clinking whir of bottles and crates. "Coca-Cola," whispered Dieter, the boy from Cologne who had learned his English from comic strips. He said it like something in church. Hans pretended not to care, but even the air seemed sweetened somehow. Yeast from the bakery, creosote from the fence posts, cut grass from the parade ground where American soldiers played baseball with a lazy, athletic cruelty to time. Sergeant Miller, their section guard, 26, a geometry teacher before the war, jaw like a box, eyes like a lake the wind had just left, stood them in a line outside the admin hut. "Intake," he said. "Name, unit, capture, medical. You'll get a bunk, a towel, and 5 canteen chits. Don't eat the chits." He smiled at the joke, almost against regulations. "Canteen chits," Hans said, tasting another new word. "Camp money," Miller replied. "Script. POWs can't use American currency. But script buys the same: soap, cigarettes, postcards, and a Coke if you're smart." Krantz clicked his tongue. "We are soldiers, not children," he said in German. "We will not be bribed by sugar water." Hans did not answer. He watched the wind skate across the tin roof, watched the green glass bottles being carried inside a low building with a sign that simply read PX-. The camp's rules marched clean and visible across a bulletin board. Geneva Convention recognized. No forced labor beyond non-military tasks. Work detachments voluntary. 8-hour day. Pay credited at equivalent of 80 cents, with camp script for purchases. Inspections weekly. Correspondence, 2 letters per month. Religious services available. Library, theater, and canteen open 1300 to 2000. Sunday, ice cream social, weather permitting. Hans read that line thrice. His brain reared like a horse. Sunday, ice cream, social. Krantz laughed when someone translated the word. Propaganda. They will parade us like tame bears. That night, the barracks creaked in the warm dark. Someone snored like a sawmill. Someone murmured a prayer to a South German saint. Hans lay awake, eyes on the roof beams, listening to insects ping the screen. In the near distance, a jukebox woke and slept and woke again, an American heart clicking out songs he didn't yet know but would. Work came as a negotiation rather than a sentence. A civilian liaison. Miss Baker, a woman with a pencil skewered in her hair like a ship's mast. Red names, farms, factories, timber crews. Volunteers get out, get paid, get less bored, she said. No one forces your hand. But my aunt's peach orchard likes hands. Krantz's cadre urged refusal. whispering that work for the enemy was betrayal. Miller asked none of the usual questions and just looked tired. Hans raised his hand. Dieter raised his. 3 others followed. Krantz's eyes glittered with patience sharpened to a knife. Farming won't teach them to love us, he told his circle that night. But the PX might. Watch the week. Hans bent over his boots and decided not to listen to anyone who had never bent over a row of vegetables in heat. Miss Baker's aunt's orchard smelled like late summer made of sugar. The fruit thudded into canvas sacks. Bees studied the men's wrists as if the muscles themselves were blossoms. Hans learned the American word for lighter, ladder, learned that the peach's skin held dust like memory, learned that an old woman could stand on a porch and hand out lemonade without flinching. "Ma'am," Dieter said, and the old woman smiled. She had a bruise fading under one eye. "Not from war," Miller murmured, "but from life knocking on a long door." She poured lemonade anyway. When Miss Baker paid out the day's script, 10 chits crisp with a blue stamp that read, Camp Aliceville. Hans felt like a child permitted to walk in a town alone, the coins singing in his pocket, the town not real, but ready. Back inside the wire, they lined up at the PX half because Krantz was watching in half because time was watching too. The canteen was cool and smelled of cardboard and sugar. Behind the counter, a black clerk with steady hands. Private Hawkins, name stitched over his heart. Uncapped bottles with a clink that sounded like school recess. He slid the first Coke to Dieter. Condensation beaded, a thread of smoke hissed from glass. Dieter took a sip, eyes widening like staging lights. "Oh," he said in English for Hawkins's benefit. "Oh." Hans put a chit on the counter, then another bold. "Two," he said, as if practicing a new rank. Hawkins nodded, moved with an economy Hans would later recognize as grace, and set down 2 bottles and a paper napkin printed with a red script logo that swirled like a river. Hans lifted the Coke, the glass heavy and democratic. The first taste was advertising come true. Cold, citric, dark, ridiculous. The second tasted like water after a long march. He closed his eyes. "This is a prison," he said aloud in German, forgetting himself, forgetting Krantz's eyes. Dieter giggled and said in English, louder than he should, "This is a prison." Hawkins's mouth lifted, just a fraction. "Sir," he said with a half bow that was not a bow at all. "Depends who you ask." On Sunday at 1400 they walked to the mess hall, expecting another lecture. Instead, there were 10 tumblers waiting under a blue-white sign. Ice cream social, all men in good standing. The chaplain shook hands like a farmer counting seed corn. 1, 2, 3. A Red Cross volunteer whose lipstick wobbled at the edges stood behind a metal trough, scooping vanilla into bowls with a gesture that could have been liturgical. Krantz stood near the door, his arms a barrier. "Refuse," he breathed. "We are not children." But refusing was its own theater, and some men were tired of theater. Hans stepped forward like someone stepping onto a river rock that might be slippery. He held out his bowl. "Bit," he said to nobody in particular. The scoop landed. It looked like December. Sergeant Miller mingled, unarmed, making jokes he'd made before. "First bite freezes your teeth," he warned. "Second bite thaws your gossip." Men laughed in 3 languages. A Victrola played something slow. The flavor was ordinary and exact. Milk, sugar, cold. In a 4th spoonful, Hans tasted the creamery, where some Alabama girl in a scarf guided the machine that made this snow. The truck that rattled the gallon cans down a road built by taxes. The War Department requisition forms that made milk into morale. He tasted a system. He looked around at the faces and saw some tasting the same. Krantz stood like a monument, a perfect outline around which the century would simply flow. That night, the hardliners came. Not with fists, with postcards. A man named Vogel, bookkeeper from Bremen under peacetime rules, block informer under these, handed Hans a card in the barracks, thin paper like ash. "You are seen. Children eat sugar. Men stand. No signature. No need." Dieter received one with a drawing. a man sipping a Coke while his country burned. Another man was cornered near the latrine and told that his sweetheart would know if he licked American spoons. Words did what fists could not. They made you doubt your own teeth. Hans lay awake and listened to the skittering of the fan belt in its housing at the end of the barracks. He remembered the farmwoman's bruise, the chits in his pocket, the way Hawkins had nodded as if they were both passing through the same experiment. He did not feel like a traitor. He felt like a man who had eaten something cold on a hot day. Recreation hour brought baseball. The Americans offered gloves like citizenships. Right field, said Miller, pointing Hans to a patch of ground beyond the chalk where the dust hung like a curtain. The first fly ball came toward him ugly and slow. He ran under it and thought of artillery shells and did not flinch. The ball smacked leather. His hand stung. The men in his barracks cheered without permission. Afterward, flushed and embarrassed by health, Hans went to the camp library. Shelves of paperbacks bled pale by many hands. A special projects division booklet lay out like bait. Why We Fight, a picture story about freedom. The drawings were bold, the caption simple, the logic steel on steel. He put it back. He was not ready to be told. At the far shelf, he found Thomas Wolfe, Of Time and the River Dash. He could not follow all the words, but the rhythm surprised him. A man who wanted more room than he would ever get, a country trying to be a room big enough. He signed a checkout card with careful letters. Weber, Hans. In the corner, a guard snuck a cigarette and pretended not to watch them read. Work detachments rotated. The week after Peaches came a dairy coop on the edge of town. The air inside the creamery was holy, clean and chemical at once, clanking with steel pails, rattling with belts. Hans watched milk become surface tension, then sound, then, in a freezer drum, ice. A white-hatted foreman, Mr. Lyle, who looked like he shaved with a butter knife, pointed at the machine. Old girl runs hot if you don't mind the brine temperature, he said. Hans nodded out of politeness and then out of interest. He had tinkered with machines on the farm near Freiburg. The foreman clocked that interest with the you and me speed that useful men share. You speak wrench? He asked. Little, Hans answered, and the foreman grinned. At the end of the shift, the foreman ladled a half pint into a paper cup and slid it across. Company policy says I can't, he said. War Department says I shouldn't. Humanity says I must. Hans looked at the cup. He lifted it like a secret. He thought of the Sunday trough in the mess hall. This tasted better, not because it was forbidden, but because it came from his hands. When they climbed into the army truck, Krantz stood at the gate like a math problem. Did you taste it? He asked, voice mild with threat. Hans could have lied. He did not. Yes. Krantz nodded as if a ledger had balanced. Then tonight you will stand up and apologize for letting your comrades down. Hans said nothing. The truck rattled. The sky over the pines was the color of Coca-Cola seen through green glass. Camp gossip traveled faster than trains. By evening, everyone knew the dairy foreman had broken no rules. Geneva allowed decent rations. The War Department's own memos encouraged fair treatment to prevent escape and maintain order. But rules on paper and rules in the barracks were different empires. After dinner, Krantz tapped his spoon against a tin cup and called the barracks to attention. We spoke in Tunisia of honor, he said softly, which was so much worse than shouting. And now, in America, we eat ice cream and become honored guests. Will we trade our oaths for cream? He called first on Dieter. The boy's voice trembled but held. I ate because I was hungry, and because I intend to live. Someone clapped once and held his hands like weapons when Krantz looked. Then Krantz turned to Hans. You, Weber. Hans stood. His knees did not shake, some stubbornness in him, some family physics. I did not apologize in Tunisia for being captured, he said. I will not apologize here for being human. A silence fell, heavy enough to bend nails. Somewhere a jukebox blinked, perfect and banal. Krantz nodded, as judges nod. Then you are marked, he said, not to Hans, but for the benefit of the air. Sergeant Miller, standing at the door for once, cleared his throat. "Evening quiet hours," he said as if reading a rule. But when the barracks broke up, he caught Hans's eye and jerked his chin toward the PX. There, Hawkins had 2 bottles waiting, and, like contraband sanctioned by angels, 2 small paper cups with scoops, so perfect they could have been cast in a foundry. "Leftover from Sunday," he said. "Thank you," Hans managed. "Don't thank me," Hawkins said. "Thank the cows. And the system. The cows don't read memos." They stood outside and drank the Coke, the ice cream chasing the cola's caramel down the throat like a bar fight that ended in a handshake. The Alabama night was cricket loud and moon warm. Hans felt 19 in a strange way he had not felt 19 in a long time. Not like a soldier counting bullets, but like a boy counting days. Monday brought the re-education films. The Special Projects Division, determined to lance the propaganda that men like Krantz carried like inoculations against doubt, hauled in a projector and hung a white sheet. They showed newsreels, charred villages in Russia, cities in rubble, men in striped uniforms staring at a lens brave enough to look back. Some of the POWs got up and left. Some watched stone-eyed. Some cried without noise. Hans stayed, breath held until pain registered. The American narrator spoke in a flat voice that neither begged nor gloated. "This is what your leaders did in your name." The room's air turned thick with handles no one would grab. After, Hans walked out into sunlight hard as chalk to the sound of a batter hitting a ball. Dieter sat on the steps, eyes too old. "They want us to deny our dead, to accept our shame," Dieter said. "They want us to know enough to survive the future," Hans answered. The 2 sentences leaned against each other like men in line. Letters arrived as if the postal service were a charmed creature that had learned to walk on water. His mother wrote from the Black Forest. Potatoes planted, the house a little broken around the edges, his sister writing to a boy who worked at the sawmill. "We pray you are treated well. We fear you will be treated too well," she wrote, that Catholic paradox that could hold any amount of pain. He wrote back on thin paper, careful about what he said and more careful about what he did not. He described the orchard, the baseball, a guard with lake eyes, a canteen that sold a drink whose bite made you forget the day's heat. He did not write the word ice cream dash. He was not sure why. At the end of that week, the rumor arrived the way rumors do, wearing a jacket of fact with a lining of fear. Some of Krantz's lieutenants planned to shame men who kept attending the Sunday ice cream socials by staging a boycott of the chapel services attached to them, making lists, posting names, but the rumor had a knife hidden inside. A work detachment scheduled for the Sunday shift at the creamery would find something wrong with the brine pump, a lesson for the foreman who had been kind. Sergeant Miller heard it because everything made noise in a camp. He found Hans behind the barracks, mending a split seam on a glove. "We need heads, not hands for this," he said low. "You know the machine. If the brine overheats, it's not just spoiled ice cream. It's a pressure hazard. We'll be there, but I need eyes inside." "You're asking me to do what I've already done," Hans said, half amused, half terrified. Miller's mouth twitched. "I'm asking you to drink a Coke after and pretend we're not allies." "I don't pretend well," Hans said. "Do your best," Miller replied. "And keep your head down." Sunday came white as enamel. The chapel bell rang, and half the camp didn't come. The mess hall scooped without comment. Hawkins whistled, a tune Hans almost recognized. And at the creamery, Mr. Lyle wiped his hands and said, "Odd smell today," which is the kind of sentence that has saved and doomed men in every century. Hans examined the brine lines. Someone had wrapped the thermostat backwards, taped to make it look sealed. It would falsely read cold while the drum ran hot, until the ice cream turned into a different kind of chemistry lesson. He looked up and saw 2 men in the window of the admin office across the yard. Not workers, not soldiers, watching like crows. He could have fixed it quietly. He did not. He called the foreman. He called Miller. He stood while the guard unscrewed the wrap with a slow, stagey patience that made the watchers flinch. Miller wrote a report on a clipboard that was part weapon, part mercy. And still, when they rode back through the gate, Krantz was there in the dust, unsmiling, a small book in his hand. He tore a page out carefully and let it fall. Hans did not read the handwriting. He had started keeping his own list of men who would be his friends after the war, the ones who ran toward hot machines instead of away. In the canteen, Hawkins set 2 Cokes and 2 paper cups on the counter, as if the routine could be a wall. "You look like you just ate fire," he said. Hans nodded, took a long drink, felt the strange American trick of sugar putting iron back in the blood. He thought, not for the first time, that systems could be used for cruelty or for rescue, and that the same machines, jukebox, creamery, Liberty Ship, could make songs or silence depending on who turned the dials. When he left the PX, Krantz was waiting like weather. "You play at being a mechanic," the man said. "You think you are saving something other than your tongue." Hans surprised himself by smiling. "Today I saved ice cream, Sergeant," he said. "Tomorrow we will see." Krantz's hand moved in the air like a man swatting a memory. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow the trains run. Tomorrow the men go to the paper mill. Tomorrow men who drink American sugar will forget their mothers." Hans thought of his mother's letter, of potatoes, of a sawmill boy. "I won't forget," he said. "I will remember that the man at the PX calls me sir when he is tired and I am thirsty." Krantz looked as if he had been slapped by an etiquette manual. That night, rain came at last, a warm curtain. The barracks roof sang. Somewhere, as if appointed by contract, the jukebox clicked awake and played a song whose chorus had the shape of a river and the duty of flag. Hans lay there, 19, a prisoner, a mechanic, a reader of American books, a drinker of enemy syrup. He understood that his war had not ended. It had changed shape into a semester. He closed his eyes, and then the siren on the perimeter fence began to wail. 3 short bursts, a pause, 3 more. Not an escape alarm, but the smaller, sharper call. Fire in a work detachment truck. Dieter shook him. "The paper mill crew," the boy said. They were due back at 9. Someone cut the fuel line. Hans was already on his feet. Hashtag part 2. The siren's 3-pulse cry cut the night like a saw. By the time Hans reached the gate, a truck sat there skewed and steaming, headlights spearing the wire. The engine compartment hissed and coughed flame. A wheel had shredded itself down to sparks. Guards sprinted with canvas extinguishers, pumping white clouds that smelled of baking soda and hard decisions. Miller shouted orders with a voice that made disorder look temporary. "Back! Keep the road clear." Dieter stumbled up beside Hans, eyes round. "Paper mill crew?" "Back 2 minutes late and lucky," a guard muttered, passing a coiled hose. Fuel line sliced. Driver smelled petrol and cut the ignition. Coasted and praying. Miller saw Hans and didn't look surprised. "You too, sand barrels now." They hauled the wooden tubs, hands slipping, and threw sand under the frame as the engine spit the last of its anger. A corporal cracked the hood on a pole like he was lifting a snake. Flames fluttered, then died, shamed by chemistry and men who refused to panic. From the infirmary, Doc Flint arrived with iodine and competence. 2 POWs had forearm burns, more insult than injury. The air tasted like pennies. Behind the wire, men pressed toward the scene as far as rules and fear allowed. Krantz was visible in that crowd like a brick in snow. Private Hawkins hustled up with a crate. Not ammo, towels packed in ice. He thrust them into hands without rank. "On the wrists, on the necks," he said. "Not your faces. Your lungs need that heat." His voice never rose. Even his breath smoked in the humid dark. Miller used his quiet voice, the one that filled up a man's skull without crossing the space to his ears. Somebody wanted this to be worse. He nudged Hans toward the parted fuel line with the end of his pencil. The cut was too clean to be accident, the rag tied to soak the line, too deliberate. They won't get a second try. The next morning brought a hearing, which looked like a meeting until you watched the pencils. The War Department called them camp disciplinary boards, A courtroom nested inside a compound. A lieutenant in his first mustache presided. Red Cross and chaplain sat as witnesses. A prisoner-elected spokesman, someone not named Krantz, occupied the other chair because last night had changed the geometry of influence. Miller spoke in paragraphs that fit on a page. The driver described smelling fuel, hearing the engine cough. Mr. Lyle from the creamery came in his apron and called the sabotage at his shop by the right names. Hans detailed the backwards thermostat and the two men in the admin window who watched and then were not there. Krantz did not take the stand because no one had told him to, and telling him to required a rank that did not live inside the board. But three of his undermen did, summoned gently by fact. Two stonewalled. The third, Vogel, the bookkeeper, blinked hard enough to rattle his wire frames and said, very small, "I warned them not to cut the truck. I only wanted lists." The board called it coercion against fellow prisoners and endangering life. They stripped Vogel of privileges and transferred him to a separate barracks under U.S. guard for his own safety and everyone else's. Krantz's status as barracks elder was revoked by the next election cycle, an elegant administrative way of saying, "Your weather system has moved on dash." When the board adjourned, Miller found Hans in the shade of the infirmary eave. "You okay?" "I didn't speak heroically," Hans said. "Only mechanically." Miller breathed a tired laugh. "That's how bridges stay up." Sunday came again, like it had somewhere to be. The boycott rumor, this time against the ice cream social, floated in the air like dandelion. Men who had kept their heads down all week faced a small decision whose echo would be loud. The mess hall doors opened at 1400. The first in line were three men from the paper mill crew, bandages bright against sunburned arms. The second was Dieter, who said "ma'am" to the Red Cross volunteer exactly as he had on the porch in the orchard. The third was Hans. Krantz watched from the barrack steps, holding no book now. He had turned inward into a country with a population of one. A few diehards stood near him, the gravity wells of their faces tugging at anyone hungry for approval. The rest of the camp did arithmetic. Then the line grew, and whatever list Vogel once kept shriveled inside a pocket, no one would check again. Hawkins, reassigned for the afternoon to help with serving, scooped with a rhythm that felt like jazz. The chaplain passed napkins. Miller circulated like an usher, exchanging "how you holding up" with men in two languages. On the far table, someone had arranged empty Coke bottles into a triangle, sun catching in the glass like small lakes. Hans ate slow. He did not look at Krantz. He looked at the men who had been burned the night before and were here, now not out of defiance, but out of ordinary appetite. He remembered the smell of a sliced fuel line and thought, a man could be steered by fear or by dessert. I choose dessert. Later, outside the PX, Hawkins handed him a bottle and gestured at the empty crates stacked by the loading dock. "You handy with wood, Hans?" "A little." Hawkins squinted at the sun. "I hate to see good bottles ride all the way back to the plant empty when we could be using him twice. You ever seen a bottle wall?" Hans shook his head. "Come on," Hawkins said. "I'll show you an idea." They built a greenhouse out of throwaways. Not that day, not in a montage, but in work details and after-hours permission slips, with sergeants' nods and Red Cross petitions. Hawkins collected empties. The carpentry detachment scrounged frame lumber from shipping pallets. The quartermaster found a surplus of twine that had decided to be rope. Every bottle became a cell of light. Stacked horizontally with their necks lashed in rows, they turned sun into a gentle machine. Miss Baker's aunt donated tomato starts. A war widow from town brought dill seeds in an apron pocket. The chaplain said a prayer that sounded suspiciously like gardening advice. The greenhouse went up beside the library, a glimmering wall humming with bees. Inside it smelled like reclaimed hope, damp soil, warm glass, a little sugar from labels that refused to wash off. Dieter painted a sign, PX Victory Garden Dash. He added a small joke in German below. Keen propaganda, nur Tomaten. No propaganda, just tomatoes. Even Krantz drifted by one afternoon and paused, uninvited and unshould, watching sun pour through the glass and make a quilt on the dirt. He looked like a man in a museum who does not believe art, but understands frame. "What are you going to do with them?" he asked without malice. "Eat them," Hans said simply. "And remember the trick." "What trick?" "That sugar can be structure. That a system can be built out of what you expected to be waste." Krantz made a face that was almost a smile. "You think like a mechanic." "Today, yes," Hans said. "Tomorrow, maybe a farmer." News from the outside came like thunder, rolling, delayed, unmistakable. June's heat brought rumors of a great fleet, and then the confirmation: Normandy. Men crowded around the bulletin board and read the Associated Press wire in English, then in the German of their hearts. Some cheered, some cursed softly, some sat down and stared at their boots and counted backward to a town they would not see this year. Hawkins marked the day by stacking the Coke bottles into a pyramid on the PX counter and saying nothing. Miller marked it by serving coffee black and strong to guards and POWs alike. The chaplain marked it by opening the chapel for silence. The Special Projects men marked it by showing films until the projector bulb cracked from duty. Hans marked it in the greenhouse, tying string for vines to climb, pretending the rest was math. Letters followed the headlines like small boats in a large wake. From home, ration cards thinner than hope, a cousin missing, a neighbor's son returned without his laughter. The tone of his mother's writing changed, like a river after a dam breaks. She did not defend the leaders now. She defended the garden. "Plant beans, Hans," she wrote. "Beans remember water the way people remember kindness." He sent her a drawing of the greenhouse, marked with measurements. He wished he could send her a Coke bottle. He worried that he was becoming American in ways that would not fit in a Black Forest kitchen. He worried that the way to be decent was now the same way, in two countries, and that he had no excuse left. The camp elections came on a hot day with clouds shaped like geography. Without intimidation, men voted for a new spokesman, Corporal Waltz, a tailor by trade, with a calm that could iron a shirt. He posted rules that fit on half a page. No coercion, no midnight courts, no lists. He sat with Miller twice a week and translated the camp's needs into requests that made both sides blush less. Krantz did not vanish. He played chess near the rec hall and lost with grace. Sometimes he stood at the fence and watched the highway like a man reading a book without turning pages. Once he stopped Hans and asked, "Do you think you will keep the taste after the war?" "Of Coca-Cola," Hans said. "Of being indulged." Hans considered. "I'm not indulged," he said. "I am supervised. And sometimes in a good week, trusted. That is different." Krantz made a small motion of concession. Perhaps when you return, you will be the guard." "I hope to be the greenhouse," Hans said, and Krantz, God help him, laughed like a man who had discovered he could. Work continued. The paper mill took crews who learned the tenderness of wood. A saw was a dangerous instrument that did not respect ideologies, only grip and grain. The foreman there, a taciturn Arkansan named Pruitt, ran the floor like a church with splinters. One afternoon, after hearing of the sabotage in the hearing, he placed a hand like a plank on Hans's shoulder and said, "Son, there's two kinds of cut, one that makes a joint and one that makes a mess. You watch what you leave behind." At the creamery, Mr. Lyle handed Hans a sheaf of diagrams. "A man in Tuscaloosa claims he can adapt this drum to run smoother on low brine," he said. "I don't need smoother. I need fewer breakdowns. Find me where the fool is hiding the stress." Hans found it, and Lyle sent a note to the board that said, dryly, "If the War Department can spare Weber for piecework, I'll take his hands for 30 years. No one took it seriously except Hans, who memorized the sentence like a prayer. On a chalk-white afternoon, the library hosted a reading of a new camp newspaper, Der Draht Dash, The Wire Dash. Dieter, who could draw, made cartoons of harmless things: a goat chewing a Red Cross label, a baseball glove dreaming of a hand. He wrote a column in English, simple, kind sentences for guards who wanted to see inside the fence without trespass. He interviewed Hawkins. "What's the best part of your job?" he asked, pencil ready. Handing somebody a cold drink when they didn't think they were thirsty, Hawkins answered without thinking. "What's the worst?" "Watching a man refuse it because he thinks it makes him less a man." Dieter drew a Coke bottle with a small crown and titled it, "The King of Small Mercies Dash." Hawkins rolled his eyes and laughed anyway. Winter brushed the wire with a different sort of loneliness. The greenhouse glowed like a hearth. The camp bakery smelled of yeast like a rumor. The PX stocked wool socks. Hawkins learned to make coffee that tasted like a decision. The Red Cross delivered Christmas packages, chocolate, cigarettes, tiny tins that clinked. Half the camp sang carols in 2 languages and discovered that harmonies share a house if asked politely. The Special Projects men ran a film called Your Job in Germany Dash, a lecture to American soldiers about how to occupy without revenge. Hans sat in the back and watched the instructions wash over the room. Be firm, be fair, do not be fooled. He felt a prickle at the base of his skull. He imagined American boys in future German streets, carrying kindness like a permit. He simultaneously wanted it and dreaded his country's need of it. He left early and found Hawkins locking up. The PX clerk watched him for a beat. "Rough movie, rough year," Hans said. Hawkins took a bottle from the crate and didn't write it down. "You know, Hans, sometimes firm and fair is what my grandma called being raised right. Folks like it more when you say it that way." "My language has holes in it," Hans confessed. "Sometimes your idioms are better than my truths." "Truth don't mind wearing a different shirt," Hawkins said, grinning. The war ended almost abruptly, even though it had taken forever. In April, rumors. In May, bells that had never been inside the wire ringing anyway. E-Day came to Camp Aliceville wrapped in confusion and relief. The guard tower flew 2 flags. The mess hall served something called victory cake, dry but decorated with an audacity of frosting. The ice cream trough worked overtime. Hawkins leaned back on his heels and scooped until his wrists ached. At evening formation, the commandant made a speech about dignity and repatriation, about rail timetables and patience. Men cheered or cried or wrote in their heads. Krantz clapped exactly twice, symbolic and real. Miller found Hans near the greenhouse and said, softly, "You'll ship out when the train says so. Might be weeks, might be months. We'll keep you fed and busy." "What will you do?" Hans asked. "Teach geometry again," Miller said. "Convince teenagers that lines meet at infinity and that their lives do not." "You will be good at both," Hans said. Miller blushed like a man and used a praise that sticks. "Take a souvenir, Weber," he said, half joking, half not. "Not a rifle, not a fence post. Something that reminds you of the version of us that was worth seeing." Hans thought of the greenhouse. He thought of baseball dirt and library cards. He thought of Hawkins counting chits like a banker at a very weird bank. He settled on a small thing, a Coke bottle cap flattened by a truck into a pressed coin, its edges soft with tire. He slipped it into his pocket, a promise disguised as litter. Repatriation was a slow river. Groups went north to camps in New Jersey, then to ships. Letters flowed in reverse. Miss Baker's aunt sent a napkin with a peach embroidered on it. Mr. Lau sent a recipe for brine and a note that read, "If you ever ice cream in Freiburg, remember salt is half the secret." Hawkins wrote a page on brown paper. "When folks ask me what I did in the war, I'm going to tell them I handed men cold Cokes and tried not to spill hope. Write if you can mail it. I don't know the rules for friends." The last Sunday before Hans' train, the ice cream line stretched and curved like handwriting. He stood in it. Dieter stood behind him, translating jokes over his shoulder and pocketing a library fine he would never pay. Krantz appeared at the edge and surprised everyone, including himself, by joining the line near the back. When the scoop reached Hans, he held out his bowl and said, "Thank you," to the Red Cross lady without the wobble of the first day. Hawkins waited outside with 2 bottles. He tapped them together, glass to glass, A toast with no alcohol, but plenty of ceremony. So he said, "Answer the question." "What question?" Hawkins tilted his head toward the wire, the towers, the world beyond. "This is a prison." Hans looked around carefully, the way you look around an old room before you leave it. The greenhouse winked. The library door was propped open by a stack of Warren Wolf and Steinbeck. On the ball field, a guard and a prisoner argued amiably about a fair/foul ball, like scholars arguing about a comma. The PX door creaked, the bell chimed, the Coca-Cola script on the napkins shone an impossible red. "It was a prison when I arrived," Hans said. "Now it's a school with fences." He took the bottle. "In a cafeteria where the desserts came on Sundays." Hawkins laughed, shook his head, and offered his hand. Hans shook it, surprise jolting through him, not that the handshake happened, but that no rules broke when it did. Miller appeared at the corner, cap in hand. "Truck's at dawn," he said. "Bring only what you can carry. Leave what we can use." "I will," Hans said. "We are leaving the greenhouse. The tomatoes are for whoever is here when they redden." Miller nodded, then added, almost shy, "Try to build one back home. We'll consider it a franchise." The train east smelled like cinders and possibility. Men talked in clumps, plans and fears in the same sentences. Some dreamed of farms that hadn't moved, some of cities smashed into possible maps. Dieter sketched the car and titled it Third Class Philosophy Dash. Someone sang a song whose words were not political and therefore safer than almost anything. Hans sat by the window and wrote, on a page torn from the camp newspaper, a list he did not want to lose. Words to keep firm and fair. Sir said to a prisoner, brine, mercy. Tools to keep wrench extension, bottle wall, box score. People to keep Miller, Hawkins, Miss Baker, Mr. Lyle. Dieter, Krantz, in memory measured. Vows to keep no secret lists, no midnight courts. Ice cream on Sundays if there is milk, books where there is light. At a siding in Tennessee, a Negro track crew waved at the POW train. A few men waved back. Hans raised his bottle cap like a coin and pretended it bought them all around. Germany met him with the smell of wet timber and the sound of a language damaged but unbroken. The Black Forest was the same, only in silhouette. The house bent a little. His mother's hands were older. Her eyes were younger. She read his face like a recipe and did not ask what he had done to deserve to be alive. They planted beans together in the ash-thick soil. He showed her the greenhouse plan and built a small version along the south wall with scavenge bottles collected from a tavern whose roof had gone missing. The first tomatoes were small and arrogant. The first cucumbers crooked. The first time a neighbor came to ask how the light stayed warm behind the glass, Hans said words that did not belong to any party, because we decided it should. He took a job at a local creamery ravaged by loss and run by a woman who knew all the valves. He wrote a letter to Mr. Lyle that crossed the ocean in a mailbag that had learned patience and arrived with a grease stain. He wrote a letter to Hawkins that crossed another ocean of habit and arrived with a note. You made it. Good. Don't forget to sit on your porch. That's where you build your country from. On Sundays, after Mass and before mending, he pushed a little cart to the square and sold paper cups of ice cream that tasted like milk and salt and making do. Children learned to count in chits because coins were scarce. He kept one bottle of Coca-Cola on a shelf, unopened, not as an idol, but as a story with a cap on it, for when he was asked by his own curious nephew, Uncle Hans, what is that? A lesson, he would answer, about what a prison can accidentally become when decent people are in charge of the desserts. Sometimes in the evenings, he took the flattened cap from his pocket and used it as a worry coin, rubbing the ridges smooth. He tried not to be nostalgic about a camp. It would be indecent to be nostalgic about a fence. But he allowed himself this, to be grateful for a season when the world taught him by surprise. On a hot July years later, a package arrived, American stamps, the handwriting slanted like laughter. Inside, a postcard of a classroom with a blackboard full of Euclid, a note from Miller, lines still meet at infinity. The kids don't believe me, but they will. My boy will be tall. And a sepia photograph of the Camp Aliceville PX greenhouse, still standing longer than regulation might have predicted, tomatoes showing off, a small sign in English and German. No propaganda, just tomatoes. Hans pinned the photo to the greenhouse frame at home. He stood there for a long time as evening leaned in. Somewhere in his neighborhood, a radio played a new American song, syrupy and impossible not to hum. A boy ran past in a baseball cap someone's uncle had bartered from a GI. He smiled and whispered at once, for himself and for the men he had known. This was a prison. Then he shook his head, satisfied with the better truth he had earned. It was a place where we learned what to do with Sunday.